Minister, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where this evening we are delighted to welcome Mr. Enrico Letta, who will deliver to us a public lecture. Before we begin, can I just describe again some ground rules for how we're going to proceed? Mr. Letta will speak for about 30 minutes, after which there will be a question and answer session. I encourage that during the lecture that people please turn off your phones or set them to silent. During the question and answer session, as you can see, we've got microphones, standing mics on each side of the auditorium. Please make your way to the microphone and ask your question. Okay. Let me turn to the main event this evening. Mr. Enrico Letta is Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris. More than that, he is former Prime Minister of Italy. Those two positions are merely endpoints of an amazing career of public service and academic thinking and writing. He is a student of law, but he is a student of affairs of the world. Second point I might make is that Mr. Letta is completely committed to the idea of Europe. He has spent a lifetime building up the institution, an institution that today is the liberal heart of the world. The third point I want to make is that he has become convinced of ASEAN's success. He wants to build ever closer ties between the Europe and the Italy that he feels so passionate about, and the emerging story that we've got here in ASEAN. I invite you to join me in welcoming Mr. Letta to the podium to deliver his lecture.
Mr. Dean, Excellencies, dear friends, I'm so happy to be here today. In 2 years is my 5th time here in Singapore. I think it's, for me, a great opportunity to share with you some ideas on this very interesting topic in a very crucial moment for the history of the European Union. I'll try to split my presentation in 2 main points. One, the present situation, the crisis that the European Union is facing, and next year, a crucial year for the future of the European Union for many reasons that I'll try to show and to share with you. And a second part, the lessons. I'll try to share with you 7 lessons. 7 is an important number in the Bible, everywhere. So I try to use this number, 7, to say 7 lessons that I took from the European experience for the integration process. But first of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Dean. It's a pleasure to be here. We have such a close and positive cooperation between the Lee Kuan Yew School and Sciences Po and the Paris School of International Affairs within Sciences Po. For us, it's a great achievement. We are very happy of this cooperation. I would like to continue and to strengthen this cooperation. And thank you also for the words that you mentioned about ASEAN. I'm here in Singapore also on behalf and thanks to the friendship and the invitation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you to the Ministry, and thank you, the Ambassador, our friend, great friend, C.K. Ho, because of the ASEAN-Europe tie that we would like to strengthen. ASEAN is living in the last 2-3 years a moment of big improvement in many important fields. In Europe, we think that it's important to strengthen this cooperation. And in Italy, first of all, my own country. This is why we created this association, the Italy-ASEAN Association. I'll leave the Dean the brochure with all the information you can find on the web, on Italy-ASEAN Association, all the informations. We are trying to work to do all the best to strengthen the relationship between Italy, Europe, and ASEAN. But I'll try to share with you some ideas on the lessons from Europe in terms of integration. So my first part is the crisis, many crises in Europe at the same time. That is the most interesting and most challenging point. Many crises at the same time. The Eurozone crisis, 2008, 10 years ago, we started with a big crisis. The virus came from the US, you remember very well, 15th of September this year. It will be the date, anniversary of 10 years of Lehman Brothers failure. 10 years. After that, many years of big crisis in Europe on the Eurozone crisis. Why I put this toolbox in the slide? You can be wondering why the toolbox. Because the crisis, this first big crisis in European history, told us that without a toolbox it's impossible to deal with a crisis. The toolbox is essential, crucial, necessary to try to fix, to arrange, to change in the good timing. And we were without the toolbox. So we were obliged to build up the toolbox during the crisis. This is why all the reforms that we in Europe, we established in 10, 11, 12, until 13, big reforms, the European Stability Mechanism, and many other important reforms, but the big problem was that the toolbox wasn't there. So it's not easy while you are in a storm to fix the room during the storm. And to fix the roof during the storm is very, very complex, very difficult. This is what we did during the crisis. We were obliged to fix the roof during the storm. This is a big lesson. We need to fix the roof when sun shines. It's essential. Without the toolbox, it's very complex to deal with all these crises. And Mario Draghi, the ECB boss, his leadership was fundamental, essential to try to reach and to get some of the solutions. At the same time, after that, immediately a second big crisis, a second big unexpected crisis. We will never expect such a crisis like the migrant crisis. This slide is just one small example of this crisis, the part of this 15, the most crucial year in the refugee crisis, with all the figures, 1 million of people in 1 year trying to get Europe, refugees from Syria, first of all, but also from other countries, and again, the lack of the toolbox. Because the European Union was, and on migration crisis, is, unfortunately, without an effective and well-working toolbox on how to manage migration flows and exceptional or extraordinary migration flows. This is why the crisis became such a huge, crucial, and very tough crisis. The lack of the toolbox on the migration crisis. Third big, I would say, unexpected crisis, Brexit. We were used at European level in the European Union to live with enlargements, further in sequence, many enlargements. We started in 6, then 28, continuous enlargement, and suddenly one leaves. Not one, the UK. The UK is not one, it's more than one. The UK is very important also in terms of general public opinion, world public opinion. The idea was when they decided to leave, look, they decided to get in not at the beginning of the European history because, I don't know, I think you know the British. I'm sure that someone of you is from the UK. The British are well known because of their pragmatism. So when they decided to get in, the message to the world in the 70s is the demonstration that the European Union, the European community at that time, is a success. Now they get out, and the message to the world was the day after, hey, look, the Britons are out, so it's a failure. Big challenge for the European integration, for the European Union. Not only because one leaves, but because of this big message, global message, and the big discussion after this event on how to discuss the Brexit procedures. And we are still there, if I may say. We are still there, and I'll try to give you, without adage, this idea on how these Brexit negotiations are complex. This is all the timetable. And this timetable means that we are in big delay because we are there, close to October 2018, but in reality, even one of the preliminary points, you know, the three preliminary points, one of them, Ireland, border of Ireland, is still unsolved. So we are close at the end of the process of the timetable. At the same time, we have plenty of unsolved situations. And it's not easy to think what will be the future, and it's not easy to think what will be next year, March the 29th, the solution and the plan that we will apply. Why? Because of this. This is the steps. These are the steps, the stairs. The future relationship. What is the future? Which will be the future relationship between the European Union and the UK? Is not easy. It's not easy at all. It's not easy because all the red line that until now the British politics put on the table of the discussion are risking to put the relationship on the far right of our slide, and the far right means to have the UK at the same level of Canada and South Korea. And frankly speaking, it's a little bit strange because nobody can say that North Korea, South Korea or Canada are European countries. And the UK is an European country. So the big risk is that all these red lines are there, are risking to put the UK in a position that is very far from the position that we hoped to have. You see there, the closest position is the position of Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Then the second one is the Swiss position, then the Ukrainian, then Turkey. And then at the end of this process, the big risk is to have the UK very far, very, very far. I put this point because Brexit is an unexpected and very risky crisis, even today, for the European Union, for the reasons I tried to say. The big crisis, and at the same time, next year. Next year is a crucial year for Europe, 19. I think you had many speakers in these years at this podium talking on behalf of the European problems. And I'm sure that all the speakers told you this year is a crucial year for the European history. And I'm telling exactly the same. Next year will be a crucial year for the European history. But I'm telling the truth. For one reason, if you give a look to the calendar for next year, for timing next year, altogether, many decisions in a very, very short period of time. first of all, Brexit. Then we started with the MFF. The MFF is the budget, is the pluriannual budget, because the European Union is not living with an annual budget. European Union is living with 7 years budget. So now we are starting the discussion of the budget for the next 7 years, from 1 to 8. This discussion will be crucial and very complex because of the Brexit, first of all. Brexit will reduce the budget of the European Union, and because of the big changes. The budget of the European Union, as you know, is different from the budget of a normal single state, because the budget of the European Union is 60% is just two issues, agriculture and structural funds. And the rest is 40% of the budget. So the big discussion of the budget will be the first part of the year, the end of this year and the next months, the first part of next year. At the same time, Brexit, with all the uncertainties that I mentioned, and the big decisions following the European elections for the leadership. The calendar is creating such a strange situation. For the first time, we will have all the first line of the European leadership changing at the same time. The Commission, Parliament first, Commission, the President of the European Council, and the President of the Central Bank. For the first time, we'll have the President of the Central Bank changing at the same time of the change of the President and the rest of the Commission. Because in the past, the Central Bank President was appointed in 3 and in 11 years in which separated from the appointment of the rest of the institutions. So you will have at the same time in 6 months all the institutions changing, all the leaders changing, and the elections of the European Parliament, this is my final point of this crucial year, next year, will be very important for one precise reason. For the first time, the political landscape of the European Parliament will change. I say for the first time because for the last 25 years after Maastricht Treaty 91-92 gave the European Parliament a big power, a big role in the confidence vote for the Commission and the legislative power. And for these 25 years, the European Parliament was one of the most stable political institutions in the world. Maybe like Singapore, maybe. Very stable political situation. Why very stable? Because the political landscape at the European level was organized around two main parties, EPP, European People's Party, the party under the leadership of the Germans, Helmut Kohl in the 90s, Angela Merkel today, and the party around the Social Democrats, on the other hand. These two parties together were always more than 50% of the European Parliament. So one agreement between these two parties, game over for any decision. And all the political leaders of the European Union in the last 25 years came from an agreement between these two parties. So a grand coalition at the European level. Why this point is so crucial for next year? Because all the forecasts are telling us that next year the elections will give us a landscape with a big fragmentation, in which the two main parties will not be the majority of the parliament. We will have a very fragmented parliament in which any decision, both on topics, agreements on trade or ratification of trade on trade, I mentioned this point that is crucial also for Singapore because of the FTA with Singapore, the FTA with Japan, with Vietnam, and so Mexico, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, the appointment of the President of the Commission, the rest of the Commission, to find an agreement within the next European Parliament will be very complex, very complicated. It will be more fragmented with all these difficulties. So next year, crucial year for the future of the European Union. Brexit, the post-Brexit, which kind of relationship with the UK, which kind of budget for the next 7 years, and which kind of political landscape and leadership for the European Union. In a period in which there's a big European integration fatigue in some societies, in some voters, in some member states. Look at this figure. I think it's interesting. Is a study at Chatham House. They organized a poll asking people to react to some questions and dividing, separating answers in two: people and elite. Look at this answer, at the answer to this question. I think it's really very interesting. Is the different perception of the European Union, the role of the European Union, what the European Union gave and did for the people. The perception that there are elites, globalized elite, very mobile elite, cosmopolitan, speaking many languages, very happy because of the European Union, because of the opportunities that the European Union gives. And at the same time, a part of our people not aware of all these opportunities and with many worries because they think that the European Union at the end of the day is the globalization, and the globalization gives fears. And here you have, I think it's interesting because it's a sort of ranking of pessimism at national level, and it's easy to see that there are some countries, the UK, France, and Italy, within the European Union, with a big level of pessimism for the future. And these countries are part of what I said before on the European Union that has not worked for all. So, what are the lessons that I would like to share with you in conclusion of this presentation? Presentation in which there are possibilities and there are opportunities. Because I leave these slides on the stage because this slide is the slide of this year that we are having. Next year is the year of the resilience of the European Union. I'm sure that the European Union will show resilience because in these very complex decisions that we have to take, the resilience of the European Union, we had crises, unexpected and unique. I mentioned the euro crisis, I mentioned Brexit, I mentioned the migrant crisis. I didn't mention terrorism, but terrorism too was a big crisis, a big threat to the European Union because it was a threat with a strong link to the migrant crisis. For many people, terrorists were also linked to the migrant flows. And so it created anxiety, fears, and all the difficulties we are knowing. So my point is that my first lesson is that integration takes time. So if I may say to the friends of ASEAN, no hurry, no hurry. I know that it's useless to say that, but I want to raise this point. No hurry. The big risk to waste everything because of hurry, because integration takes time. The European Union today gets all the results that we are having, even with all these difficulties, but we are able to overcome this crisis because of the resilience of the institutions and because of the resilience of the results. So integration takes time. The second point, and my second lesson, is that integration has to be an incremental process. That is fundamental. An incremental process. Step by step, with sequences, long-term objectives, and consequential intermediate steps. Always with the link to the final goal. All the history of the success of the single market in Europe is exactly the demonstration of this final goal. The final goal was the 4 freedoms within the single market, and at the same time, step by step, always thinking and looking at this final step. If you lose this link, you lose the meaning of what you are doing. It is very important to have this link and to show this link to the people. Third point is the need of legitimacy in any steps. All the steps are to be have to be legitimate and clearly legitimate in the relationship with the people. This is what today, in the history of the crisis and the difficulties of the European Union, the resilience of the European Union today is because the legitimacy of all the decisions. All the decisions we took in the last decades were decisions with a strong legitimacy, formal legitimacy, and in some way also substantial legitimacy. And legitimacy is very important. When there's a lack of legitimacy, there are problems. We experienced problems within the European discussion because of a lack of legitimacy in some decisions. This is why legitimacy is so important. My fourth point is about the famous scapegoat. Be careful. The scapegoat is the big risk. When you build up a supranational level, the scapegoat risk is the most important one. Scapegoat risk means at the lower level it's very easy to say you are guilty. You up, you are guilty. And to say to the people, the responsible are those in Brussels, are those in Jakarta, as those I don't know where. And it is not only for supranational institutions, it's also for federal institutions. If you remember what Trump did in his electoral campaign and what Trump said against Washington, D.C., the capital, he said exactly the same of some Brexiters saying on Brussels. Brussels, Washington, D.C. And the result was that in Washington, D.C., Hillary Clinton took 93% of the votes during the elections, and she lost the elections, and Trump took 7% of the votes in the capital. So the key point, the scapegoat, is a big risk. Is absolutely necessary to avoid the scapegoat. How to avoid the scapegoat? The supranational level has to work very hard on many, many important things that are related to culture, education. Culture, education. The most important flag of the European integration is the name Erasmus. Erasmus is a name very familiar for many of you. It's the name of education. Is the name of opportunities for young people. It's the most important realization, achievement of the European Union. So to avoid scapegoat risk, it's necessary to have a supranational level investing very much on culture, on education, investing on facing inequalities. That is the other key point. If the supranational level is perceived as useful, positive, I think it's possible, not sure, but possible to avoid the scapegoat. My fifth point is about it's impossible to get successful achievements in terms of integration without supranational institutions. The idea to have significant steps only in an intergovernmental, horizontal level with unanimity rules, I think it's very difficult to get it. It's very difficult, and European history is there to teach us that the only way is to have a combination of both. You need to have relationship between governments and at the same time some leading processes, ideas, utopias with supranational level. The European Commission means Jacques Delors, means this idea of the supranational level, trying to give a dream to the people and to give a dream. Erasmus was a dream becoming reality, or dreams like that. My sixth point is that be careful. The bureaucracy is the I think is the worst enemy of any integration process. If there's immediately the perception of an integration process, meaning more bureaucracy or adding another level of bureaucracy, that will kill any successful integration. That is, I think, the history, and I would say the negative history of the European integration, accused to be too much bureaucratic. And I think my lesson, the sixth lesson, is that the fight against red tape is one of the most important mission for the supranational level. And my seventh and final point is very easy to say, is very complex to act. Integration needs leadership. It's impossible to get successful integration without leadership. The European history is a history of leadership. At the very beginning, De Gasperi, Adenauer, Schuman, Monnet, then Kohl, Delors, Mitterrand, is a history of leadership. Leadership, leaders, European leaders and leaders at national level, having and taking the responsibility to try to identify goals, dreams, and to make dreams reality. And this leadership is absolutely essential. Without leadership, there's no integration and there's no successful integration. I don't know if these 7 lessons can be translated into the ASEAN language. I don't know, and I'm not here to give lessons at all. I'm sure that the ASEAN future will be a future without any need of external lesson, because it's a successful experience until now, and I'm sure that it will be a successful experience. This is why I personally bet on the ASEAN integration, and I think the ASEAN integration is essential for the future of the world. And I am here also to say that we, the Europeans, we, the Italians, we, the universities, my universities, Sciences Po, my School of International Affairs, Paris School of International Affairs, we are all working, thinking that the future will be a peaceful future, a future of cooperation, if this part of the world plays a crucial and responsible job to help in that direction. And I'm sure that that will be the future. What I just tried to share with you was the idea of an European Union with a decade of crisis, overcoming this difficult, unexpected, unique crisis, and ready for next year to try to overcome new crises. I think the European Union after next year will be different in any way. The decisions that we will take will change the shape of the European Union. I am truly optimistic in life and for Europe, and I'm sure that the European Union will be better in 2 years' time. So next time I will be here, we will have a new and better European Union. Thank you very much.
You took us through some downs and some ups. You had me very worried about in terms of the recitation of the waves of pessimism, the negativity that has emerged in different parts of the world, but also in your depiction of the difference between the elite perception and the general public. And it's with great admiration that I saw how you took us from this quite dire view of what the situation was like through your story of the wonderful lessons from Europe that we needed to have in mind going forwards. And I could see how you end with the optimism that you do. I want to share that optimism. I was in Britain the day that Britain left Europe, or thought it did, the day of the Brexit referendum. And it was a shock to many of us. I might add a third city to your pair of Washington and Brussels, because London too has a story that is different from that of the perception of the rest of the country. There are many issues to unpack in this discussion. I also wanted to talk about how your view of some of the root causes of these crises, which you describe, but we might want to unpack a little bit further. The single currency decision, the decision made on supranationalism versus an ASEAN way kind of approach to integration that we have here. Lots of issues to unpack. I want to invite the audience to begin our conversation, as it were. So those of you who wish, you can come up to one of the microphones, identify yourself, and ask your question. So, sir, please.
So my question is actually about money. So how do you see NATO and the European Union member in the future handle the balance between the immigration cost for handling immigration and the defense budget, especially given the current situation that United States is, the current president is actually having a lot of pressure on European Union members on the defense budgets and try to ask them to pay, according to Trump, like the fair share. And while at the same time within the European Union countries, we do see some of the defense industry of the European Union members may not be capable of maintaining the current level. Like some of the German destroyer got some problems previously in the shipyard. They cannot build the destroyer on their own in a good standard. So how do you see European Union and NATO handle this?
Well, you know, Trump is a big threat for the European Union as a whole. That is very clear. It's a big threat, first of all, because of trade. What happened on trade until now is a big threat for all of us, for the European Union, because it's exactly the opposite. Trump is saying that we, the US, we produce more, we produce less than our domestic consumption, and you, the Europeans, you do exactly the opposite. So we have to rebalance. But for us, the Europeans, if we rebalance and if we lose our capacity to produce for the world and not only for our domestic market, is the difference between death or life for Europe. So for us, it's a mortal threat. But I mentioned this point of trade because I am worried on trade with what Trump said. I am less worried on what Trump said on security and on NATO. Because what Trump said on and did on trade is absolutely new in the history of the US. He killed multilateral organization, he killed WTO, he changed completely the mood towards free trade. What Trump did and said until now on NATO, on burden sharing, in terms of words, is rude as Trump is usually. But in terms of substance, it is not so different from what I heard from Obama, from what I heard personally from George W. Bush, because the idea of the burden sharing is something that is clear after the Berlin Wall fall. The idea to have a rebalancing within the alliance, it is, I think, true and it is correct. The problem is the timing of this burden sharing, of the application of the burden sharing, and frankly speaking, I have no fear on that direction. I think that the words of Trump there are rude as usual, but the facts are less worrying. I fear very much Trump on trade, if I may say. I fear what Trump is doing on trade, because on trade, that means that the European Union has to retaliate. We can't accept what Trump is doing on trade, and a retaliation of the European Union can be the beginning of an escalation, a very complex situation. There are many possible positive outcomes of that. Singapore, Japan, the fact that the European Union now is able to sign and ratify very fast the agreement with Japan, the agreement with Singapore, I think are good news for Singapore and Japan, is the reaction of Trump Is the European Union saying, hey, look, we have alternatives. We have other options. And we will pursue these other options. This is why in few weeks, the negotiation with Japan, in few months, the negotiation with Singapore, I think it's a good reaction of the European Union. It's the demonstration of the European Union in good shape in fields in which the supranational level has the power. It is another lesson I would like to raise. The European Union is able to react very fast on trade. Why? Because treaties give the power to the Commission, to the supranational level. So the Commission, Cecilia Malmström is doing a fantastic job there, is able on Japan, on Singapore, to negotiate, and we can, we hope, October the 18th, to have the signature of the agreement, the FTA Singapore, the European Union, and to have the ratification by the end of the European legislature.
Thank you, Mr. Letta. I thought one of the really interesting things that came out of this conversation was the greater danger that Trump poses to world trade than he does to security, understanding, and arrangements. And Trump, of course, now carries the story. I mean, he's embarked on this $100 billion trade war with China. He has this view of world trade as being one of zero sum. If you are carrying a trade surplus relative to mine, you are somehow winning and I am losing. And he carries that view in a way that's extremely disruptive for how the world needs to go forwards in a multilateral understanding. That is really, you put your finger on something really very threatening about the Trump administration and the stories that it tells.
Do you think that the EU is actually the driving force of the separation movements in Europe? Because I saw the EU do have some various mechanisms, programs to directly grant the budget to the local governments of European states, bypassing the central governments of European states. So do you think the EU is actually the driving force of the separation movements in Europe?
No, I don't think so. I think that you are referring to the structural funds, I think. Structural funds are a big part of the European budget. Structural funds are crucial for the relaunch and the rebalancing of geographical inequalities. I mentioned before inequalities. Geographical inequalities are one of the main problems of the European Union, and I think the European Union is still there. The problem of inequalities is still there, both geographical and social inequalities. The structural funds are there to help the less developed part of our continent. And the structural funds are successful. Look at the central and eastern part of Europe. In 2 decades, countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, the Baltic countries, the Baltic countries were part of the Soviet Union. Now, I mentioned Estonia. I know better Estonian than the others. Estonia is one of the leaders of the innovation within the European Union, thanks to the European policies. So I mentioned another, I think, interesting figure, Poland and Ukraine. I think it's interesting to show that being in or being out, it makes the difference. Poland and Ukraine were at the same level during the communist time. Poland and Ukraine were the 2 main pillars of the European part of the communist Soviet Empire. And in 89, 90, Poland and Ukraine had the same figures in terms of health of society. I make 2 examples. One, life expectancy. Second, children mortality. These 2 countries in 89 had exactly the same figures on life expectancy and children mortality. If you get today the figures, you understand what is the European Union. and what is being part of the European Union. Because Poland, who decided to be on board of the European Union train, today is at the same level of France, Italy, Spain, with both these figures. The Ukraine didn't, unfortunately, and Ukraine is far from this. So when I say that, I say that the difference between being in and being out is not a difference of directive or bureaucracy. It's difference between death and life, because children mortality or life expectancy means death or life. This is why I think on these points, the work of the structural funds, the work of the European policies were successful, and maybe we have to continue and we have to implement, because on some different aspects we didn't. I mentioned my own country. It is not a successful story, the story of structural funds in the south of my country. I know that, I assume that, and very sad by saying that. But in many other countries and in other scenarios, it was a big success. And I think the Eastern European story is exactly the demonstration of that.
Absolutely, very powerful, powerful example. Thank you.
Mr. Letta, I'm Henry Chen from East Asia Institute. I got two questions. First is that you talk about the problem of Brexit, and it seems that there's a lot of internal government issue now with Prime Minister May. So in your personal judgment, which out of the latter's relationship is most likely outcome, consider the time constraint? And also, is there any possibility of the Brexit being overruled? So the second question is on the WTO, because when Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang visited Germany, he has an agreement with Prime Minister Merkel on the need to reform WTO. So how is the possibility of WTO being reformed with or without the United States? Because China and EU together account for 30% of the world trade, which is more than double that of the United States.
In the context that I'm sadly observing at the moment, where the decadence of the political and social communication has arrived at the point that I heard unfair comments on the Erasmus program as being addressed to only an elite. How, if they don't even grasp the meaning of one of the most successful programs, results of the EU, one of the flag, as you mentioned, of the EU, how can we get back the sympathy of all these voters with who I'm afraid they represent the majority sometimes even in our parliament at the moment?
I start with this question. I thank you very much for your question. That allows me to say that one of my dreams, if I have the magic wand, what can I do? No euro, no ESM, no investment, no. One thing. Erasmus for the students of the secondary school. Binding Erasmus for them. All the young men, women, 14, 15, 16 years old, in all our schools around Europe, the possibility to get 3 months, 4 months of their scholarity, of their activity, in another school, in another country. It could be the revolution in cultural terms, because true, Erasmus is a success, but you know very well that Erasmus was a success for 3 million Europeans. And the European Union means 500 million people, and I say 3 millions in 30 years. So is really a very, very short minority. The key point is how to get the totality of our societies. When I say all the young men and women of 14 years old, I say their families. I say families without any possibility to give their children the opportunity to get 4 months in another country. And when you live, as you are doing now here, very brightly, the possibility to live in another country for months and months, you understand that this country is home for you. This country is not your enemy. You understand immediately that nationalism is the enemy of wisdom, because nationalism is only the way to try to have an enemy, a very easy enemy. And the scapegoat is the ruin of the progress, the scapegoat and the nationalism. And if you spend your childhood or the period of your life in which you can learn, you and your parents, your family, that living in another country means being at home there too, it's a revolution for you, it's a revolution for your family, and you live with open mind. So this is why my dream is to have in the next legislature at the European Union the first starting of this project. It is possible today to have some months or 1 year secondary school in another country, but it's just for a minority of our students. We need to have it all over Europe for all our students. It could be really the revolution. One word about Brexit. I think your question is correct, and I think there are two extremes. On the one hand, the cliff edge. The cliff edge means we arrive and the 29th of March without any solution. And then the day after, puff. The other solution, they name it Brino. Brexit in name only. That is a fantastic acronym, I think. To say, okay, it was a joke. It's very difficult to say today what will be the solution, because it is not, if I may say, I don't want to be misunderstood. But the big difficulty today is the fact that it is no more a negotiation between London and Brussels. It is a negotiation within London. And for us, the Europeans, it's very difficult today to understand where is the beef, if I may say. Because until now, it is an internal fight between or among many different. So we need to understand what will be the bottom line of the discussion, and then maybe I can answer your question. So I have to come back in autumn. On the WTO, I strongly believe that the world level needs multilateral organizations. I think the big threat of Trump is against multilateralism. And I think China has a big opportunity there. Because if China becomes the big defender, the big supporter of multilateralism in the world today, China gets a lot of points, of positive points. What China did on climate change, for instance, on the Paris Agreement, I think great achievement for them, great achievement. So I think the possibility to have a reform of the WTO is very useful. We have to welcome it, and we have to work in that direction because it is absolutely necessary.
My name is Mogi. I am a Master in Public Administration candidate at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I'm from Mongolia. As Dean Danny wanted at the very beginning, you want a gender balance, so I'm going to let the lady behind me ask the question first, and I'll follow later.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Good evening. My name is Elena Zigliotti. I'm a political theorist from Singapore Management University. My question concerns Italy and the relation of Italy with the European Union. You mentioned that you are very positive about the EU. I would like to know if you are positive also about our current government. And what do you think this government can do in 2019, next year? So such a critical year for Europe, how we are going to address this relation?
Dr. Letta, you mentioned that migration and terrorism was one of the major issues behind the crisis that European Union is facing, and perhaps the migration issue was perhaps the biggest reason behind the Brexit and therefore the situation that the European Union is. I wanted to ask a question where, what do you think the role European countries, especially perhaps the Western European countries and even the United States played in creating the root causes behind this mass migration into Europe and from the Middle East and Africa? As history shows that after colonization of Africa and the Middle East and the division of a lot of countries after the First World War, where countries created very arbitrary borders and creating countries that never existed before, and borders that seems like were created, putting a ruler and a pencil in a very perpendicular, very straight line borders, and creating, forcing people with different ethnic, different racial backgrounds to live in one country and creating a lot of the problems, and therefore creating this mass migration into Europe. What do you think the European countries played in the root cause of it? And if you see the media today, these topics are not covered. Most of the blame is on the Middle Eastern countries themselves, the African countries themselves. They were the ones who are fighting with each other, but we don't talk about, I think, the elephant in the room, where European countries actually played a very, very major role in creating that mess.
So when we are talking about regional integration, do you think we also need to look into the idea of what constitutes Europe anymore? For example, when you have countries like Kazakhstan, which have a large cultural tie with, ties with Europe more than they have with South Asia or East Asia right now. So the concept of what Europe within itself is, do you think we need to expand it and move it more towards actors who have shared cultural ties with it than just be defined by the geographical boundaries of what you arbitrarily decided are states?
On Italy, it depends on, until now, many words, but it's not clear what will be really the policies and the proposals. Next year will be a year in which, starting with the MFF discussions and all the other points that I mentioned, facts will be there. So we expect and we wait for facts, and then we will judge. Until now, the fear is about the fact that if the migration issue becomes and remains the first issue of the European stage and European discussion, that's a problem. That's a problem. We need, at the European level, to address in a balanced, fair, and correct way, in a European way, this issue. We didn't do until now, and the problem of the lack of the toolbox for the migration issue is still there. It is not failure of the European institutions. I think it's the responsibility of member states, because too many member states preferred to say we leave the virus in the countries where the virus is. And today, countries with virus means Italy, Greece, and Germany, mostly. And it is not correct, I think, because the problem is a general problem, and the European Union has to address this problem in general way. So I prefer to say that this key point and the way in which we will address at the European level this point will be decisive also for Italy. And I hope that the Italian position will be a positive one. But we can talk again in some months on this point. You are completely right on the point of root causes. But if I may say, I would like to add the responsibility of the US, because you mentioned European countries.
Yes.
Because when I see the point about the countries of origin of the refugees getting Europe in 2015, I don't have the slide with me, but you have half of this million of people getting Europe in 15, half of this million are from 3 countries. And these 3 countries are Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And these 3 countries are the failed wars of the US and the West during the last 20 years. So I think there's a clear link a clear responsibility. And Syria is there because of Iraq. There's a direct link between Syria and Iraq. So it is clear that today we, Europeans, we are paying the price of a crisis because of big problems in the back. The final question was.
I think we've covered the. We've covered the.
With Kazakhstan and the enlargement.
Idea, what is Europe?
My point is that the European Union is the 27 countries. If the UK confirms Brexit, 27, maybe plus some Balkan countries ready to be in. But for the rest, we have to organize a neighboring policy that is important, that is useful, positive, and potential successful. But it's very complicated to think that there will be the possibility to have new enlargement to Turkey or to, you mentioned Kazakhstan and so on and so forth. Today, there's a big enlargement fatigue within the European member states. And I think this fatigue is not correct. We have always to think to the alternative, to the other options. I say always imagine a European Union without the enlargement. We enlarged, taking advantage of the only 10 years in the world history in which Russia slept. And it was decisive because we created links with the rest of Eastern and Central Europe, decisive links, decisive link. Today it would be absolutely different, the European and world history, with another enlargement policy. So I defend enlargement. I think it was painful, it was difficult, many problems, but in terms of geopolitical, historical, big decisions, it was crucial, and we have to continue to give attention to this part of the world.
I work for the Spain Tourism Board. I was born in Manila. I lived in Hanoi, Vietnam for 5 years, and now I'm here in Singapore. I would like to echo the point by the Dean earlier on the currency. I'm at the moment taking my Master of Studies on ASEAN Studies. And my question is, how important is single currency in integration? And if your answer is yes, how would you advise? Because you earlier said that integration should be taken step by step, which is a very good advice. I mean, having seen what the European Union has experienced, what would be the 3 important steps that you would advise ASEAN towards single currency?
I really share your vision for the idea of teenagers in Europe. You know, I think it would be great for kids in Budapest to go to Berlin and kids in Berlin to go to Birmingham. But what troubles me, I suppose, is that when people who believe strongly in the European project speak in that way, that's when I feel that the EU borders into an ideological project rather than a straightforward international institution. And that it might be that kind of language that has alienated some of the voters, not just where I'm from, but actually across the EU, including in some of the net recipient states that you mentioned in Central and Eastern Europe, to become really turned off from that kind of rhetoric, which can seem, if I may, can possibly seem slightly condescending or, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be what people want to hear. So it worries me that still we aren't changing the way that we speak about this in a way that might reach out to some of these people that have been so disillusioned by the European project. So your views on that I'd welcome.
I think my point is related to the fact that this kind of achievement would give or could give positive effects on the long term. I can't imagine that doing such Erasmus for teenagers in the next 2 years we will have a change in European society. But thinking to the next generation is the change is huge in terms of mentality. And the change is huge because we can avoid what is happening today. I see in Europe a rise of nationalism, a rise of the idea of the neighboring country is the enemy. The neighboring country is the responsible for my problems. That is really the worst situation that we can imagine within the European Union. The big strength, the big asset of the European Union is exactly the fact that we started eventually to think that it is a win-win process. I am Italian, France, Germany, Spain, the UK. What is positive for me is positive for you. It is exactly the opposite of the past. The past was what is positive for me, it is automatically negative for you. And the wars came exactly because of this philosophy. So I think we have to be really very careful of what is happening today. Because this rise of nationalism, with this populism pushing for the scapegoat, the easy scapegoat is always the neighboring country. Neighboring country is the responsible for my problem. And this is why I think giving the possibility to the young generation to feel to be at home in the neighboring country is the only way to avoid this feeling. Really, I think it's a problem, I would say, quite physical problem. This is why I think, and this is why I mentioned this point, we are out of time, so for me it's very difficult to answer la primera pregunta. Primera pregunta es muy interesante, pero muy difícil para mí. Because the suggestions, I don't think that you can have a single currency in ASEAN for the next period of time because you need to have many steps before thinking to a single currency. There are too many differences between among the ASEAN member states to think. And maybe in the European Union, one of the lessons is that the single currency was applied in a dimension with too many inequalities and too many differences. So the work to rebalance these differences before having a single currency is absolutely decisive. So I think until now, if I may say, the biggest suggestion, the only suggestion I would like to leave is the fact that the most successful achievement of the European Union is the single market. Is the fact that when I say single market, I say 4 freedoms. The fact that I can today live in Paris, being in Rome, working in Spain, without any bureaucratic problem, without any difference. It is a fantastic asset for the European citizens. And it's a fantastic asset for European entrepreneurs, for European students, European professors, and it's a way to be more competitive because as university in Paris, I can attract Italian professors, Italian students. In a university in PISA, in my hometown, I can attract UK professors or Spanish professors. I think getting out the single market will be one of the most difficult situation that the UK will leave for the university, because the strength and the possibility to take advantage of being part of the single market of the UK universities was one of the reasons of the success, also the universal success of the UK universities. And so I think the next step of ASEAN has to be the creation of a single market. Without the creation of a single market, any other steps are impossible. All the other steps are impossible, and I think is the only way to think to the future. Frankly speaking, I don't guess that the single currency can be the next step. It's a very far step, and the European history is exactly telling us that before you have to create the possibility to have a unique single market, and the four freedoms are the crucial and the most important achievement that we did at the European level.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It is a testament to, Mr. Letta, the wisdom and the passion with which you've approached this subject, that you've been able to engage so many of us, so that even after the length of time that we've spent discussing this, there remains an excess supply of people who want to engage with you still. I'm afraid that I really have to call a close to this event. I want to thank the audience for the time and attention and your participation that's made for such a lively conversation. And I invite you to join me in thanking my good friend Enrico for the amazing evening he's given us.